So I mentioned in class a couple of times that administrative law research isn't at the forefront when you practice in the area of criminal law, unlike areas like environmental law, securities, insurance, immigration, all those areas that you hear about being heavily regulated. You need to be really familiar with researching regs. Not so much in the world of criminal law, but I still wanted to talk a little bit about them so you guys have some basic familiarity with what regulations are, and where to find them. So, just as a bit of background, if you think about the three branches of government, right? Case law comes out of the judicial branch, statutes come out of the legislative branch, and then regulations come out of the executive branch from administrative agencies. So, there are laws passed by administrative agencies like the Department of Justice, which is one thing we'll be talking about on the federal regulatory level in a couple of seconds, the Environmental Protection Agency, the SEC, and so on. So I just wanted to really quickly show you guys a good website for federal regulations. This is a website called FedSys, where you can find a really nice PDF version of the United States Code and session laws. We mentioned this earlier in our statutory part of the class. For regulations, the two big publications are the Code of Federal Regulations and the Federal Register. The Federal Register is where all federal regulations are published on a weekday basis in chronological order. So this is sort of the regulatory equivalent of session laws, which we talked about when we were talking about statutes, right? They're published in chronological order. There's no subject-based arrangement, and as such, it's not particularly useful for a researcher. And much like on the statutory level, that made it necessary to come up with a subject-based code. So that's the Code of Federal Regulations, which you'll often hear referred to as the CFR. 50 titles, similar to the United States Code on the statutory level. So just a quick website I wanted to point out. The publications on this site replicate the print sets, so they're not necessarily as up to date, so I'm not going to spend much time on here. If you're actually doing federal regulations research in the real world, you'll probably be using Lexis or Wes, which are very up to date, or this free website from the United States Government Printing Office called the ECFR, stands for the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. It's very, very up to date. And a great free resource that I recommend if you wind up doing regulatory research either in criminal practice on the federal level or you wind up in a different area of the law. So just to sort of show you guys what a regulation looks like, you can see laid out by title, right? They don't necessarily align with the statutory titles in the United States Code. Right, so Title 17, Commodity and Securities Exchange, this is where you'd find SEC regs, FDA regs, and Title 51 or 21. Okay, ATF regs, these could potentially be useful as a criminal practitioner. And then I want to look at Title 28, Judicial Administration. This is where regulations for the Department of Justice are. So should you wind up one day being a DOJ attorney, this is something where you'd want to, something that you would want to know how to find and navigate. So Title 28, Judicial Administration, you'll see that there are regulations for a few different agencies in here, the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Prisons, and so forth. Okay, so we'll just take a look at the DOJ regs. You'll see these have to do executive clemency, parole, some things about gambling devices, and so on. So sort of potentially relevant for a criminal practitioner. Again, not going to come up a lot, but I just want you to know what these look like. And you'll notice when you click in, very, very similar to what statutes look like. You'll have a definition section often, and then into the actual regulations, which look a lot like a statute, right? So this is talking about eligibility for parole of federal prisoners, okay? Much like statutes, historical notes. So this was originally put into place in August 1977. This is where that was published chronologically in the Federal Register, and then amended in 1985 and 1988. So no real annotations, but you do get some historical information. So that's why people would often use something like Westlaw, as you could get the additional info. So just to show you guys on Westlaw, pull up this exact reg, Title 28 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. Back over here and check my citation, 2.2. So if you had a site, you could just plug that into the search bar on Lexis or Westlaw. You get the text, similar credits, but like I said, on what Lexis and West, you also get the additional information, notes of decision, some historical information. This has been cited. This reg has been cited 78 times. Context and analysis, so this is where you get references to helpful secondary sources and so on. Okay. You could do the same thing on Lexis by plugging in that citation here, or you could browse through the CFR. Okay. I'm going to flip back over to Westlaw really quickly, talk a little bit about state regulations. Tends to work the same way, where states publish. We're going to go through New York. States will publish regulations in something called a register, just like the Federal Register. So New York has a register, Mass has a register. That's the chronological publication. But what you'd be working with mainly as a researcher is the regulatory code, okay, the subject-based code. You can see arranged by agency. And I mentioned in class that the thing that will often come up, especially as new criminal practitioners, are breathalyzer tests and whether they've been administered properly. Particularly as a defense attorney, it's something you would want to be aware of. So we're just going to type in breathalyzer and see what we get in the New York regs. So imagine you need to figure out the requirements for administering one. So the first hit, breath analysis instruments. This is usually going to be regulated by the Department of Public Health. So you can click in. We're in section 59.4. So you probably want to go up, use that table of contents, get a sense of the surrounding landscape. Always look for your definition sections and so on. The techniques that are supposed to be used. The permits for the instrumentation that are being used, the operator permit. Someone has to have proper training before they're authorized. So again, as a defense attorney, this is something you would want to be look at. Was the instrumentation handled in the way that's appropriate? Was it certified as being in good condition? Was the officer that was operating the breathalyzer properly trained? Okay. And one thing to keep in mind is I did a search for breathalyzer as one word. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. In regulations, it does tend to be referred to as breath analysis. So just keep that in mind for future searching. Usually a breathalyzer is used somewhere, so you'll get in the general vicinity. But again, just keep in mind, often referred to as breath analysis. Okay, so that's finding New York regs on Westlaw next. Let me just click over to Lexis Classic so you guys have seen. Again, that's the CFR is going to be under federal legal. For states, browse for your state, and then the administrative code is going to be with the statutes, regulations, administrative materials, and this other administrative materials heading, that's going to be agency decisions. Right, so say an actual agency decision issued by the Environmental Protection Agency or the SEC. Okay. Lexis's publication of the New York Administrative Code is called New York Codes, Rules, and Regulations. If that wasn't particularly apparent to you, always make use of the eye icon, right? And you can see from the summary, it contains active regulations of agencies, departments, and institutions of the state of New York. Sometimes people get confused and aren't sure if they're looking at the statutory code, which would be the Consolidated Law Service, or the administrative code. Okay, so same thing, you could click in. You could browse the Department of Health regs. You could run a natural language search. We'll do breath analysis this time. And it will lead you to the same part of the code, right? Title 10, New York Code Rules Regulations, Section 59. And always on Lexis, just keep in mind on the top left, you can go back to your table of contents view and get a more detailed table of contents view for that part. Okay. On Lexis Advance, you could use your filters just like you could on Westlaw Next and run a big search. You could limit to administrative codes, New York, do a search, say, for breathalyzer or breath analysis. On Lexis Advance, keep in mind that you're going to be getting the registers, so the chronological publication, along with the actual administrative code. So just go ahead and filter to the code. Okay, and then you'll see, same thing, 10, New York Code Rules Regulations, Section 59.4. Long, confusing text, right? You can browse through, and you can jump up here and look at the table of contents. All right, so that's just a really, really quick introduction to administrative law research. I think that's really all that's necessary if you're going to be practicing as a criminal attorney, just to know the basics. You want to look for the administrative code for your jurisdiction, which on the federal level will be the Code of Federal Regulations. In Massachusetts, it's the Code of Massachusetts Regulations, or the CMR. New York, the New York Code of Rules and Regulations. So, and the Blue Book can often help you determine if you're having trouble figuring out the name of the actual administrative code for your jurisdiction. All right. So after watching the video, please do the question that I posted on TED-Ed, which will have to do with finding Massachusetts regulations, just so you can get a feel for how those work. And as always, please